hung myself from a tree fort that I had in the backyard, and it was really the presence of the birch trees there that had been my friends since I was born in the middle of Alaska that really saved my life. I felt their presence and their awareness of me, and just felt this sense of like that there was something to return to in life that was benevolent and safe. I had a high dose psilocybin journey at a festival in the middle of Alaska, and I laid my body down in the forest and I left it and was communing with God or spirit or whatever you want to call it. And it felt like I had this choice point moment where I could return to my body, or if I wanted to transition and leave the world for good, I could. I made a very definitive choice at that moment.
If you want to hear what he felt in that moment and how it changed his life, listen to the full episode of Noble Warrior.
Welcome to Noble Warrior. This is where accomplished people sharpen the mind and deepen their soul. Ian Michael bridges what most people keep separate: Western psychology and indigenous plant medicine traditions. He trained under Stan Grof, apprenticed with lineages from Mexico and Peru, and now runs Holos, a 200-acre retreat center in Costa Rica where he works with leaders who want to go as deep on their inner game as they have gone on their outer one. In this conversation, we talked about the Egg Model of Consciousness, a framework of navigating expanded state without losing your center, why the guide matters more than the substance, how breathwork accesses the same territory as psychedelics, why spatial design is nervous system technology, not just aesthetic preference, and the difference between balance and harmony, and why high performers need the latter. Please enjoy my conversation with Ian Michaels. Welcome to the podcast, Ian. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Really appreciate the invitation.
So let me jump right into the deep end, because as we do here on Noble Warrior, this is what we do. So I've been doing a lot of research on some of the podcasts that you've been on before, and you're very open about your past experiences. I wanted to bring us back to your earlier struggle with depression and suicidal thoughts. You shared this on Psychedelics today, and if you don't mind, bring us back to the first time that you have had psychedelics and how it had reset your nervous system and changed your outlook of life altogether. Bring us back to that moment. So for the people who are listening, who may be going through their own dark night of the soul moments, may question certain things, or maybe suffering in some ways, can also get related to your story as well. That would be super helpful.
Absolutely. So I would say that my struggle with depression, anxiety started maybe even before I was 11, but I did attempt suicide when I was 11. I hung myself from a tree fort that I had in the backyard, and it was really the presence of the birch trees there that had been my friends since I was born in the middle of Alaska that really saved my life. I felt their presence and their awareness of me, and just felt this sense of like that there was something to return to in life that was benevolent and safe. And then years went by. I ended up being on SSRIs, I think, when I was 12 or 13 years old. And I had a therapist and all these things. And for those that aren't aware, SSRIs are basically antidepressants. And what it did for me was provided a little bit of a buffer for a period of time before I could actually sort out what was happening in my psyche and in my life that didn't feel good. And so I'm grateful that there is Western medicine. But then in my early teens, maybe 15, I discovered psychedelics. And very quickly that shifted me out of the old mindsets. I resolved a lot of the trauma that I had and helped me see through a new lens. I experimented a lot in my teenage years. I was part of a party culture in the middle of Alaska, or I would say more of an experimental culture. We were all kind of trying to figure out the world, curious about shamanism, curious about psychedelics. And by the time I was 17, I really felt complete with that chapter. I had a high dose psilocybin journey at a festival in the middle of Alaska, and I laid my body down in the forest and I left it and was communing with God or spirit or whatever you want to call it. And it felt like I had this choice point moment where I could return to my body, or if I wanted to transition and leave the world for good, I could. I made a very definitive choice at that moment. Yes, life is worth living, and I'm going to return to being Ian Michael and keep going. And from that point forward, that was a very definitive moment that a lot shifted. And I turned my attention more towards meditation and esoteric practices and became really disciplined on that path and just having a direct communion with spirit. And that lasted for about 14 years until after many life chapters, I discovered Burning Man and ayahuasca and a lot of different things that now have become more a part of my practice in life.
So that's big picture, right? So I want to
Mhm.
zoom back in a little bit more on the earlier chapters in your life. It sounded more like a self-taught DIY type style of just exploring one's mind. At that time, did you have any kind of guidance, teachings, principles, teachers as a way to help you do that? Or is it purely just DIY? Let me just experiment with different
Yeah.
substances, experiences with your peers of similar age and just discovering together.
Yeah. I think that it was a mix of the two things. Primarily, I think that the sense of community and all these young people that I was friends with were just people that were curious about life, really sincere and open hearted. And that provided a fairly safe container. Mushrooms or LSD, usually in a setting where we had a container of time and activities and things that we were doing. And that was really supportive. But I was very much seeking a teacher or support. And so at one point, I had an indigenous man that kind of took me under his wing. He was a neo-shamanic indigenous man from the middle of Alaska. And I just had really good, like, adult figures in my life. My mom and stepdad were very intellectual people, had a lot of connections to the university, and they provided like a larger backdrop and context for my life that I think held those transformations well. They certainly weren't supportive of my exploration of hallucinogens and psychedelics, but they were really like a safe space to go to that I could explore my thoughts. But I would say that as far as support in those explorations, it was reading texts that I found in my family's cabin. We have a little cabin in Denali National Park that has no running water or electricity, but a really great little library that my parents picked up in the 60s and 70s. So, like reading Ram Dass's Be Here Now was really helpful for my life, or reading Paramahansa Yogananda. And these teachers and many others, they provided a little bit of scaffolding and, oh, this is what you're experiencing in consciousness. And they had done it through meditation or other means, but it really provided a guidepost for me of, oh, okay, this is how you navigate expanded states of awareness.
Now, I asked that question specifically because as I've experimented in many different things, my background is a PhD back science and evidence based. So very much I like the thematic script structured approach to life.
Yeah.
Knowing what I know today, in the beginning part is very much DIY, neo shamanism, just pick up from books in that way. Knowing what I know today, there's a huge difference in actually having a good teacher,
Yeah.
somebody of integrity, somebody who's been trained for generations, and there's a knowledge that can be quite explained because this type of things is very subjective, very personal. So not having a teacher is in some ways dangerous because physically, mentally, all the things, right? I'm lucky in that way that I have a good head on my shoulder. I have a good peer group, and God was blessing me with all the right experiences and all the things. But
Mhm.
knowing what I know today, I would say, hey, find someone who's a trustworthy guide and who has had the
Yeah.
trainings and who has high integrity, reputation, etc. So, what's your thought on that? Knowing what you
Yeah.
know today.
Now that I have a master's in psychology and have studied under some great teachers and people that hold plant medicine traditions in very traditional ways, whether the Wirikuta from northern Mexico or Shipibo mestizo traditions with ayahuasca from Peru, I feel like it's really important to have a teacher and to have that support. When I was in grad school, I studied a system of psychology that looks at the psyche as an egg. It's called psychosynthesis. And that's like the egg of awareness. And there's a higher and lower unconscious. So the higher unconscious being like intuition, creativity, these higher expanded states of consciousness, the lower unconscious being like the base needs that we have, and then some of the impulses and different ways that we can express our psyche that way. The way that I look at psychedelics and moving into non-ordinary states of consciousness, you're like expanding that membrane of what is possible for you to experience as a human being. And having a mentor or a teacher provides like the outer support so that if you pop out of what you're comfortable with, you have somebody that can help hold and contain that experience to bring you back to assemblage point that is stable. But, you know, that there are cautionary tales that I've seen in my life with friends that either passed because they had a psychotic break and committed suicide, or when I was in high school, I had a buddy that he took LSD and he never came back to school. Something clicked in his psyche and the way that he was held. His mom found out he was on LSD, and that created a whole complex that he got stuck in for like many, many years. And he and I recently actually reconnected and checked in, and he shared some of the nuances of what happened. But I had so many friends that I either lost actually physically to drug abuse or to suicide, or friends that I lost psychologically because they just couldn't reintegrate after an experience they had. So I think that it's really wise to have a good guide and a teacher. These are like extremely powerful chemicals and medicines. You could call them medicines, but ultimately they're really powerful chemicals that they can throw your whole system out of whack unless you have the right container and work with the right amount of medicine. The membrane, if you expand it too quickly and you pop through, it's really hard to integrate those states of consciousness. One compound that's really popular right now is 5-MeO DMT, can be found in the bufo toad or can be made synthetically. 5-MeO can be such a rapid experience of all that is.
This is great.
Part of technology.
Your articulation, there's an egg and there's membranes, and these type of catalyst medicine enable us to expand beyond. In my articulation, these catalysts are non-specific amplifiers, enhances our subjectivity and sensitivity to go beyond what we normally are aware of. That's my articulation to my students. Is that an accurate recap of what you said?
Yeah, exactly. So when that amplifier pushes our perception beyond its normal bounds, it's like we're starting to leave the egg of our normal perceptual limitations.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, it's really about knowing one's approach, knowing one's limit, so that we stretch ourselves, but we don't break ourselves physically or mentally.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that true teachers are fairly rare. And so, as we've seen in the more public psychedelic space in the US, there's been a number of, you could call them gurus or teachers or people that have held the psychedelic space who then we find out have very human qualities that have caused a lot of harm to their students and to others. And so, power and influence are something that always need to be checked. And it's like when I was becoming a therapist, any really good therapist also has their own counsel and their own therapist to help them to look at cases, look at people, look at other perspectives. And I think that there's some people in the psychedelic space who develop God complexes. And the thing is with psychedelics, like you said, they can be non-specific amplifiers, but they can also amplify the ego and the sense of self. And so there's a little bit of a story of caution there. And at the same time, there are great teachers. And this is why I've gotten more comfortable moving into the plant medicine world since returning to the world of psychedelics over a decade after my early exploration. And that is because those indigenous traditions often have people that are observed by their community or are chosen to be groomed over the course of a long period of time. And there's a context for that work. When that context leaves the village or leaves the culture that it's in, there's a whole list of ramifications that come with that as well. I feel like having a good teacher is really important, but then also just being discerning and trusting your own intuition as to who is going to be a good guide for you. And developing that discernment is not easy.
For sure. I recently just came back from the Indigenous Ayahuasca conference about a month ago, where essentially, if you think about it, it's more like a United Nation type of gathering of all the different tribes from Peru, Colombia, United States, Mexico, you name it. There were 35 nations represented in that conference. And
Mhm.
one of my biggest takeaway, and this is more personal, was, oh, these are human beings just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
So the mental model that I developed was, okay, you go to your doctor for medical advice, as an example, but you don't ask your doctor for relationship advice, financial advice. It's just not the right thing to do, I think, right? So
Yeah.
I really like what you're pointing to is to be discerning about who you entrust your psyche, your spiritual development with the right teacher, with the right training and integrity and reputation and generational training, as well as the community aspect of it as well. Because
Yeah.
then not only you have the one-to-one relationship, but you also have the supportive peers and other generational ranks to support you in your journey as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting and limited things about the development of the psychedelic culture in the West is that it's not in the same context that some of these medicines were explored back in the day. Psilocybin in the traditions, or ayahuasca in the various Amazonian traditions, or working with peyote in the traditions. There's all of these places where they developed a relationship with these plants, but it was always in the context of community or apprenticeship. And so now you take psychedelics out of that context and it doesn't have the same container of support that it once had. So if you go through a major journey on peyote and you're living in a village and people are observing that and supporting you through the transformation that you're going through, it's a very different thing than in the West if people are experimenting or even have guides but don't have the community support. And I see that a lot where when people have deconstructed their life through the expanded perception they have from psychedelics, and then if they don't have that support network around them to be like, oh, hey, it's okay that you have this newfound perspective. And it can be very jarring, especially because Western civilization and living in cities is already so isolating. And so I think it's a really important thing to look at.
You mentioned about your psychology academic training. So I'm actually curious because I came from the academic world and then I went into Silicon Valley, entrepreneurial. So I won't say polar opposite. In the academic world is just trust the process. You're standing on the shoulders of giants. In the entrepreneurial world, the ethos is very much screw the tradition, just the first order principle, and then think from that perspective. So, how do you integrate the training aspect of it as well as these indigenous cultural wisdom traditions that you had mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, some of it comes down to as simple as right and left brained approaches to healing. There's like the more clinical approaches and structured approaches that came from Freud and others, where it's, or you could go as far as like CBT and all of these approaches that really are cognitive based and rework your psyche from that ground level. And then there's the others that are more intuition based and dreams and Jungian. Even just in Western psychology, there's a pretty big spread of those that just focus on the mechanisms and those that focus on the psyche as a living organism or a living presence. I think that finding the right balance for each person, some people culturally come from a place where it's very helpful to have that structure. And there's other people that come from more of the animistic traditions, the more shamanistic traditions. They're a lot more alive in the right brain approaches. So they're looking at art and music and the psyche being developed in those ways. Yeah, I think it's really a person by person basis of meeting somebody where they're at. If you bring somebody that's very structured, accountant, whatever it is, and bring them to a plant medicine ceremony where it's all singing and very relational, it may take a moment for them to find their place inside of that. And if you bring somebody that is more animistic and shamanic, focused in nature, and you bring them to a clinic and administer ketamine in this very particular way, that's going to feel really foreign to them. So I think that there's lots of approaches that are presented at this moment in time, and it's for each person to discern what feels right for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have the good fortune of interview some world-renowned shamans, people like that. And I
Mhm.
ask them questions like mental models and what's your relationship with the divine? And they just looked at me like I was speaking a totally different language. How do you calibrate? Because Holos is a retreat center and people come with all kinds of different backgrounds. They may not have the rich educational background or the intellectual dedication that you have done, with all the
Mhm.
readings and all the psychedelic experiences or encounters with indigenous cultures. How do you assess where they're at and meet them where they're at?
Yeah, I think the key thing is really attunement. Like for anybody that's doing work with psychology or work with psychedelics, any practitioner and facilitator, one of the most important tools is attunement. And so you're in this constant dance of tracking the other person's nervous system and their level of engagement. You can tell when people are checking out or overwhelmed. I think it's really setting up the right conditions, the right setting for people to feel really comfortable, and then starting to peel back the layers. And it's very natural for people to bump up against these different areas of contraction or anxiety. We have Western trained psychologists and people that bring those kind of skills. And then we also work in very traditional ways and bring in people that are trained by indigenous tradition. We're always trying to strike that balance. The foundations of Holos are built on the teachings of Stan Groff. He has some really interesting ways that throughout his own journey, he's bridged the Eastern and Western approaches, or the indigenous and the Western psychology approaches. He started as a psychiatry student who had witnessed hundreds of LSD journeys in the Czech Republic because they were testing LSD during that time, even before he had his own experience. So I think that there's something to be said for having that grounding and structure in an approach of research, and then also realizing that there's things that the mind and that research can't really fathom, like what you were talking about, some of the folks that you've worked with that come from these indigenous traditions, and nature's the teacher. Nature not only doesn't think the same way that humans do in the same structures, but the languages are non-linguistic. They're not based on our ideas and structures of words. And I find personally that psychedelics really speak through pictures and through music and through other modalities. And that feels really comfortable to me. I shared earlier, it was the birch trees that really saved my life when I was 11 years old. And it's not that they had a conversation with me and talked me down from my attempted suicide. All they did was provide presence and care and some guidelines. Growing up in the middle of Alaska, I'm a lot more comfortable with those non-verbal, non-linguistic ways of communicating just through presence. And so when I say that there's an importance in attunement as a facilitator, that attunement is largely somatic and relational in a non-linguistic way.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said. Because I'm a guide, you're a guide, right? So it's not like we're competing or anything. People resonate with different ways of translating that. Maybe someone would really resonate with Dr. Joe, who's very scientific and data driven. And maybe someone really resonates with the Sakuru type of approach or whoever, right? That's very Zen Cohen. What do you mean? I don't understand. And they somehow figure it out. Really is art of translating this type of phenomenology in a way that resonates with whoever it is that we speak to. I think that's really the mark of a great teacher.
The other thing that is a hallmark of what we do here is it's mostly group retreats. There's some one-on-one work that happens, but I've found that the group and the collective itself starts to become a self-regulating organism. So there may be somebody that is really feeling isolated because they come from a very different background than others, but then they'll find these threads of commonality within the group that starts to stitch a support network. And then those support networks are what carry people beyond the ceremonies, beyond the retreat experience into life. And so we really try to encourage the weaving of that, which goes back to that original context that a lot of these traditions had, which is it was done in a ceremonial context in community.
Yeah. Beautiful. This may be a good segue into breathwork. You had mentioned earlier about your relationships with Stanis Grof, one of the OGs of this world. All right. He's been doing this for what is it, 50 years or some
Yeah,
high, really,
more.
really high numbers. His life's work. Breathwork. If you don't want to do psychedelics, that's fine. You can use air and oxygen as a way to get into non-ordinary states of consciousness, and then people have an experience, and that could be a gateway to explore some other realms or substances or medicines or catalysts. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, in your own journey, how have you used breath work as a way to help understand yourself better and understanding this reality for what it is, consciousness and all?
There was that 13-year period from 18 to 31, which I was mostly exploring meditation and raising kids. I had no psychedelic experiences during that time, but I had very non-ordinary states of consciousness experiences through meditation and then ultimately through breath work. When I came to breath work, I was 26 years old and I had just come back from India. I was visiting my teacher in India and I was in the process of going through a divorce, and something happened where I came back from India and it felt like the center of my chest was the Grand Canyon. There was just an immense amount of pain. I didn't go through a divorce that was aggressive or anything like that. It was very peaceful. We just separated ways, but there was something deeper that was happening. And I started going to doctors trying to understand because it physiologically was hurting in my chest. And a friend of the family was a naturopath. And so I went into his office and he said, let's just try something. And so he was like, lay down on the table and let's start to do some breathing. And this was more in the tradition of rebirthing breath work. He had me breathing into my stomach and breathing into my chest. And then through this oscillations of the breathing and kind of this continuous breath, it started to open up the energy in my chest. And I went into some really interesting journeys where I became a swan. And then eventually I went back to childhood and I could see my parents fighting in the kitchen. And I could feel the way that their words were becoming daggers at each other's hearts. And I, as this little being of 4 or 5 years old, started to take on all that pain because I was really open and sensitive. So for most of my childhood into my 20s, I had been carrying this pain of my parents and their struggles in my heart. And the breath work just started to crack it open. And then, with the help of this naturopath friend, I went in and cared for this younger self of mine and ultimately did a lot of healing through it. And I just realized the power of the breath in that first session. And then, throughout my 20s and into my early 30s, I used breath work as the gateway into my healing processes that I needed. Anytime I had something coming up relationally or with work or anxiety, I would go to breath work to understand it better. And I moved to the Bay Area in my late 20s to do my master's in psychology. And I couldn't find a rebirthing breath worker. So I just looked on Yelp or something like breathwork practitioners and found a holotropic breathwork practitioner in San Francisco, and that became my like monthly practice of how to tune in and how to shift energy. And then ultimately met Stan and did a breathwork training. As I was finishing my work at Esalen about 8 years ago, Stan came to me and wanted to build a center, and that's what ultimately became Holos. So breathwork has been this like adjunct in my life to psychedelics, or something that is just as powerful as a healing modality. Stan
Right?
had a very similar journey in that he started in the Czech Republic being an LSD researcher and a psychiatry student. Then he moved to the US because of political reasons and started researching and working in LSD in the US. But those programs all started getting shut down in the 50s and 60s. So he ended up moving to Esalen Institute in Big Sur, and he became the curator of groups and teachers there for a little over a decade. During that time, he developed holotropic breathwork as a means of accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness and doing healing work without having to do psychedelics. It's the original medicine. It's like our first breath was what helped individuate us as a human being apart from our mother. And one of the things that I really love about Stan's work that not a lot of people know is about the perinatal matrices, which is the stages of the birth process. and how those impact us throughout our life. And it's really interesting that using holotropic breath work or using breath work generally or psychedelics can bring you back and regress you all the way to those original moments that you were being born and how strong of an imprint those are on your body and your psyche. For whatever reason, very regularly in retreats and in the work here that we do, a lot of people have rebirth experiences where they're working through birth trauma and clearing those patterns. So yeah, breath work has been a real blessing to my life. And it also, I think, can be an easier entry point for a lot of people that aren't ready to experience psilocybin or ayahuasca. It's, are you ready to breathe? And so that's something we're doing every day and a lot more accessible for many people.
Now, obviously, there's many different types of breath work. Those are great. And can you maybe, since you're a practitioner, speak a little bit about how is it different? Why would you choose, let's say, holotropic breath versus some other type of breath?
Yeah, I think they all have their place. There are pranayamic practices in the yogic traditions in India for thousands and thousands of years. Like the yogic practices are a science of the body and of the energy of the human organism. And so I think it's just really what is calling to you and doing the research into the breath work that you're presented with, because I do think that some of these practices aren't for everyone. Like Wim Hof breathing can be fairly intense for some people, and having the right container of support is really important too. So, one of the hallmark things of holotropic breath work is you usually have a breather and a sitter, and you have somebody that's really supporting you through your breathwork journey. And I've really preferred one on one sessions where it's me and a practitioner, or potentially a group setting where there's people monitoring and supporting, because you can move really quickly into some pretty intense states. And so having the right support, I think, is the primary thing. There's also lots of forms of holotropic or things that are like holotropic breath work that are being practiced in the world today. And I've found benefit in many of them. Some of them have breath holds, some of them don't, but breath work is something that's pretty well tried and true to access non-ordinary states of consciousness. But I do think that it's important, just like with psychedelics, to have support and have a guide. I have heard anecdotal stories of people that have had spiritual emergencies doing yogic breath work and activating the Kundalini and cracking their psyche in that way.
So maybe you can speak a little bit about the depth of consciousness that you can go with holotropic breathing a little bit, because again, I'm not well practiced in the holotropic breath work. So maybe you can share with us what's possible with holotropic.
There's a great documentary movie, Way of the Psychonaut, which is about Stan's life. And there's a couple instances where they share some of the stories of places that people have gone in holotropic breath work, in work practices, full rebirthing processes, or things that look like demon possessions or communion with angels, whatever it is. But if you look at a lot of the original spiritual texts around the world, whether they come from India or the Bible, the Old Testament, or the New Testament, there's so many references to the breath and to the word. So, like John, in the beginning was the word. And if we're speaking words, we're speaking them through breath. And so you could think of the breath as like an emanation of the creator. So it's like when we breathe out, creation is breathed out, and when we breathe in, creation is breathed in. And so I think that breath work can take you back all the way to those original impulses that created the entirety of the universe. Or it could be something more in your own biography, which could bring you back to your birth, or it could bring you back to a moment in your life where something takes your breath away. It could be a thing of beauty. It could be that sometimes we hold our breath when we're tense. And so there's something about the breath that can unlock those experiences and bring you back. I've had moments where I've been breathing, and like that example of something taking your breath away, where I could smell the flowers of an experience I had as a teenager or younger, or I could smell the fall leaves. And so I think there's a way that breath is connected to memories in a really visceral way in our somatic makeup, because there's memories held in our cells in the way that we contracted or the way that we expanded in any given experience. And the breath can be an access point that helps us relive those experiences.
Very cool. So it's like a mechanism that could take us back to our younger childhoods, the birthing experience, even the primordial before there's a form. What's the experience of reality? That's really cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed, I'm Chinese. I'm curious since I don't have access to Stan. Has he ever talked about the holotropic breathwork philosophy in comparison or in parallel with Qigong, Tai Chi, some of these other practices that's all around breath? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I know that he's written something over 30 books, and I know that some of them explore some of these universal patterns and symbols. I think it's all just different names for the same phenomena. I am not well versed in Chinese culture or the Tao or some of the things that underlie the basic psyche of the Chinese culture, or even things that are in your own body. So I'm sure that you know about the phenomena or have heard of the phenomena of ancestral healing and the way that we carry things from our culture. Even if we're born in a different culture, we still have imprints and ways of being that are expressed through our genetics and through our epigenetics. The way that I understood it as I was studying psychology, there's a lot of folks in the East that really somaticize trauma, or when things come up in their lives, they didn't always have the mechanisms for expressing it in a context of psychology or Western psychology. A lot of it more was like the felt sense of an experience. And for every culture and every person, there's a different access point. And I think that the breath is a common access point, and we can all experience it in different ways. And so activating chi, or like in India, they'd probably call it kundalini, is definitely possible through the breath. It's like I consider the breath like priming the pump of the fire of the chi. It's like when you're using a bellows, they used to have these bellows that they would get the fires going, and they would squeeze a bellow. So that's what's happening in our body as we breathe. It's like activating the fire, it's activating the chi, it's activating the kundalini. There's ways of translating psyche that psyche also means breath. It can mean the mind, it can mean the breath, it can mean the spirit. And so they're all synonymous, and breath becomes that vehicle by which we can experience chi, which is a universal phenomena. It's not
mm.
just something that's in our own bodies.
Now, as a scientist, as an innovator, one of the things I like to do as a nerd to nerd out about all of these different tools and techniques that I learn is I like to stack them, right? So, have you ever stack breath work with ayahuasca ceremonies as a way to see how it impacts or compounds or things
Yeah.
like that? Or maybe for some who is more of a traditionalist, nope, don't mess with the tradition.
Yeah, it may be contrary to a lot of traditions, but I do have particular things that I like to put together. So with ayahuasca, we often encourage people to find their breath if they're having a particularly intense moment, but not necessarily to use it as a way of amplifying the experience. With San Pedro, there are very clear traditions with San Pedro, but it's something that I think is found more broadly throughout the Americas, and I feel a little bit more creative liberty for the way that I work with San Pedro. So I came from a particular tradition of how to hold the medicine. And during the center arc of the journey, a lot of different things can happen. There could be one on one healing work, going for a hike, a lot of different possibilities for what happens during that time. And sometimes I incorporate breath work or holotropic breath work. And I usually do that when I see that there's a couple or a number of individuals that are ready to experience a deeper expression of their emotions, or there's like some energy stuck. And then as soon as you have some reasonable dose of San Pedro and you start going into breath work, things get amplified really quickly. I find those two tools to go together really well. I don't usually mix medicines, and I know there's people that do. Maybe on a recreational level, like sassafras and mushrooms can be a really supportive combination. But I think that there's a lot more to discover about how we could utilize breath work and low dose psychedelic experiences. There's always some caution there just because you're starting to ramp up the physiology and the organism in a particular way. And you just want to know that people are in a really stable state physiologically before you go into doing something like that. But yeah, I've had incredible experiences personally as well as a practitioner working with a little bit of San Pedro and doing breath work.
And I see them as mechanisms, tools that I can stack as a way to help me enter different portals effectively.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know your thoughts. It sounds like you're similar to me. I like to mix and match,
Yeah,
but in a sacred way, in an intentional way, not, oh, recreationally, let me just do whatever,
exactly.
stack it in everything. So maybe you
Yeah.
can speak a little bit about that because I think for the people who are listening, some are less, shall we say, rigid, maybe to the
Yeah.
point of whatever, let's just stack them all, have the experience possible, versus
Yeah.
some of the ones who are, no, this is the right way, the only way, and no other way. So maybe you can speak about that, how you formulate your current philosophy today.
Yeah, I would say that I am somewhere in the middle of the road in terms of permissiveness and being a traditionalist. I've served a lot of folks in the entrepreneurial community of Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, and they're some of the most challenging folks to work with because they have had such a recreational, exploratory kind of approach to all of this that when you try to work with them in a little bit more structured way, there's like some rebelling or just discomfort with that. But there's reasons that there's some guidelines and like rails that some of these experiences have because when you're cracking the psyche open that wide, people need to find a pathway back. There's a joke in the ayahuasca community. How many ayahuasqueros does it take to screw in a light bulb? And it's an infinite number because one is up there and then the other one right behind them is saying, "Oh no, you need to be singing this song," or "No, you need to be saging in this way." And so it's like everybody has a different approach to how to screw the light bulb in and how to do the healing work. And I tend to just work with the things that have worked really well for me or that my teachers have taught me. But yeah, there's a lot of tools that can be mixed in, I feel, in ways that are really simple. So, for instance, the breath work. If you have somebody that's well trained in breath work and can really understand who they're working with, that's something to really layer in an easy way. The other thing in our San Pedro ceremonies that we layer in is dance. And dance was a really powerful tool for me when I was at Institute. Before I really got back into psychedelics, I learned about five rhythms dance. Five Rhythms Dance was started at Institute, I believe, in the 70s by a woman named Gabrielle Roth. And she was working with Fritz Perls, who's a Gestalt therapist. And she had a dancer, but was injured. So she went to Esalen to do some healing. And at one point, she just got so frustrated with the dialectic kind of approach to healing and just having these conversations. And she said, "I just need to go move my body." And he said, "Great, go do that." So then she developed this, it's a movement meditation, but a way of healing through dance. And so, similar to breath work, it's a way of using the body to access healing. And so, dance, I think, is one of the things that we generally don't think about as a really strong healing modality. People go dance recreationally and all these things, but that's another one that I like to stack into San Pedro ceremonies. And sometimes people are a little bit awkward at first. They're like, "Oh, okay, I'm having this medicine experience in this ceremony, and now you're asking me to move my body." But then as they start to move their body, they find places that they have been holding tension or emotions or whatever it is. And things can become animated really quickly, or people can cry or laugh. I think there's a lot more to explore in the world of psychedelics and plant medicine with somatics. Traditionally, when people worked with San Pedro in South America, they often would go on hikes. And it was like you're working with San Pedro, you're with your shaman, and you're just hiking through the Andes. I think there's something more to explore there in terms of the somatics of healing. holotropic breath work and those practices, they've become a lot more interested about how to support people with touch. And I know that's something in psychology that's taboo a lot of the time, because there was these traditions of psychology where you're with your clinician and there's a therapeutic relationship and you don't bridge that. But touch is really important for healing. If it can be done in a safe and held container, it's really important, I think, for people's healing and their ability to feel safe in the world. So that's one curiosity I have, is will the more clinical approaches start to recognize that there's these somatic approaches to healing that can be incorporated into the psychedelic or plant medicine healing world?
Thank you for that. One of the things I say to my students all the time is healing is moving energy. We
Mhm.
have just illustrated two ways, and there's many ways, but two ways, right? One is breath, using it to move the energy throughout your body, as well as your psyche, as well as dancing. And this particular one is five rhythms, but really it's just moving the body. I'm curious because we serve similar type of clientele archetypes where
Yeah.
people are normally really heady, right? What are some of the ways that you can encourage them to move their body so then they start to develop that somatic practice? Because as they say in a lot of the books, the body holds the memories of the psyche, etc. Right? So I think for me personally, this is a personal interest. What would you say to someone who is very heady normally and develop that somatic awareness and somatic practices as well to move the energy from within?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's times when I'm actually working with someone where I can see that they're totally lost in their head, and just helping them tune back into their breath or into something that is more the sensory world. Sometimes you have to take people on a journey, go for a walk or do something that really gets them back into their body and out of the thinking mind. And sometimes it's just the right dose of medicine will turn people's mind off. And so there's practitioners, and sometimes when I'm serving, where it's like you're slowly building up the dosage till people get to the point where, okay, they're really able to access the somatics or really able to access a visionary state, because there's so much chatter in the mind, and we're so used to being on our devices and accessing the world in very particular ways. And I find that psychedelics or some of these expanded states of consciousness are ways that we can get out of the thinking mind. And so that's what I'm looking for, is like, where is the entry point for each person to get out of the thinking mind, where they can have a direct experience of reality. And that could be a direct experience of a flower or a bird or whatever it is, but that fundamental human experience of awe. Because as soon as you can get into awe, then your mind kind of shuts off. So when I've looked for places that I want to contribute to a retreat center or building something, I physically look for a space where that's the experience, like at Esalen on the cliffs of Big Sur or here at Holos in the Diamante Valley. I look for a place that takes your breath away, where it's like, whoa, okay. And the same thing in terms of practices. It's like, if you can show somebody that they have a capacity that they never realized before, or that they can see the world in a new way, it brings that same state of awe. And then the mind you start to watch tries to come back in. But I think that's the membrane that we talked about earlier. It's like, how much can we help people into the frontiers of their own perceptive capacities? Yeah.
I like that. Thanks for that, man. So I want to get into spatial design a little bit because that was your background, right? Architecture. And then spatial design is hugely important for you. You actually had, I believe, a few podcasts about it, specifically how you design the space such that it fosters transformation.
Mhm.
But maybe you can share a little bit about that. And I will tell you, most transformations, whether it be Tony Robbins or some other transformational programs, is pretty bland, right? Spatial design wise, right? Office buildings, conference centers, maybe
Yeah.
someone's home or a garage, which is okay. It's no problem. But then I have also been to the Amazon jungle, sit with the medicine, going over there where they have shahoots. It's well designed, it's beautiful. You get to see the starry skies and then obviously the jungle all around and you hear the cicadas. It's a beautiful experience. So
Yeah.
maybe as someone who was trained in spatial design, you can speak a little bit about that. How spatial design play an important role in someone's transformation.
Absolutely. So I grew up the son of a home builder. So like thinking about space, and he was a custom home builder. So we got to design a lot of buildings that reflected people's individual needs and their passions, or maybe their background and their family. So I think about like, what is the ideal place that I would like to experience transformation, and then try to build around that. Design into a building, which is like sacred geometry. So there's the Fibonacci sequence, or the phi ratio, and the way that is reflected in all natural processes. Or I was just in the Pantheon with my daughter in Rome last week, and there's ways that building is built around these particular ratios. So that's one of the things we do, just structurally, is build with particular ratios. And then there's geometric forms that just give you the sense of being held in particular ways. Our buildings here at Holos are pretty much built around hexagonal geometry. So you're like in a honeycomb, and there are these big undulating domes. And so there's a sense of being both in the womb, but also having the spaciousness of the mountains. That's something that I'm really passionate about, that the inner and outer realities reflect each other. And like you said, you can have a powerful experience in somebody's living room, or somewhere else, or in a big conference center with Tony Robbins. But there's something uniquely important for me about when you have those transformational moments, that you have a connection to nature and that you feel really held by the elements. So we've designed all of our spaces here to have that nesting quality, but I also really like to incorporate elements into the design that reflect the place. So, like in Big Sur, we had the redwoods, and the redwoods are like the original cathedrals. So, if you go out into the redwood forest, it's like you're in the majesty of something just as beautiful as the basilica or whatever it is. And down here in the rainforest and with the waterfalls, it's like nature has already given you a palette of beauty. So we've built structures that really incorporate that out of bamboo, and that open up to nature and have that free flowing energy of this place in Costa Rica. And it's a huge passion of mine to help people have very direct interactions with the elements. So trying to incorporate in rock to represent the earth and give people a sense of grounding, incorporating aspects where there's a lot of air and the air can move through, and you can have the whispers of the breeze that maybe share something with you, having the element of fire and dedicated fire pits and places where we cook food, and then an element of the water. And so we have a 600-foot waterfall to the east of the ridge that we have the retreat center on, and pretty much everything is in reverence to that 600-foot waterfall. And then there's some really interesting phenomena that we didn't plan into the buildings, but that popped up afterwards serendipitously. We have about 2 kilometers of river along the property, which is way down in the canyon. And when you're in the temple and you walk through the front door gateway, you can hear the waterfall from the canyon below. Somehow the geometry of this shape grabs and amplifies the sound of the waterfalls and dumps it at the entrance to the temple. So every time you're walking into the temple, you're actually, whether you notice it or not, being bathed in the sound of waterfalls. And that just was something magical that happened. But like creating spaces that allow for the possibility of serendipity and magic, and for people to connect. And there's a lot of different considerations, and something I'm really passionate about, obviously. But ultimately, listening is the first key. So listening to the landscape, listening to the creatures, listening to what forms are already there. In the temple that we designed and built here, the first one was built around this geometry of the honeycomb. Bees actually came and inhabited this temple. So in the west side of the temple, there's some areas where we keep all the purge buckets for the ayahuasca. And for some reason, these little stingless Mariola bees, which create a honey that's really therapeutic, they kept going into the purge buckets and building their house. And so at some point, we just left them. We tried to bring the buckets out and give them a new home, but they just liked this one particular place. And I like to think that it's because of the harmonics of the geometry of the building that they're like, oh, this is our home. This looks like a big honeycomb. We're going to take up residency here. But yeah, really listening to the landscape and how you can reflect that landscape in the forms that you create.
I love that. I really appreciate what you said about the intentional thinking behind actively bringing the elements so that people can experience magic. And what I'm also hearing is a natural way for them to come home, relevant to nature and the elements, etc. So I'm actually curious, as a follow-up question, why nature, why the elements? Because that's not something that I typically hear people say when they talk about transformational work. I do hear from the shamans that I speak to, nature is a huge influence in their relationship with it. But I don't want to project their perspective to you. I'm curious to know why the elements, why nature?
I think that just growing up in Alaska had that hardwired into my system to have that deep relationship with the elements. But there's ways that the elements are reflected in our language that we don't even realize. Water being something that we think of in terms of emotions and flow. The elements in balance create the conditions for life. So I think of the four primary elements of earth, water, air, and fire as the collaborators for the container of spirit. So, like spirit, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, if you have those four elements, that's what makes life possible. So, if we reflect those elements in our structures or in our lives, or we meditate on the elements, then we can bring about the conditions for more life or more spirit to flow through our life. So somebody is really stuck. You could say that they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's too much calcification of their life happening. And so maybe you want to bring in the element of water or more air. Or you could say that they're really airy and they're floating up there in the sky and they have all these ideas, but then they don't know how to ground them. Or there's somebody that's really fiery. What do you do to balance out the fire? You bring in some more of a water element and an earth element. So I think of it like a dance or like you're trying to make balance within people. And a lot of the Eastern traditions of medicine, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, they really look at things in terms of the elements and do you have balance between these different pieces in your life? So I think it's just a lost art that we haven't recognized yet in Western medicine and Western psychology, but it's something that's present in our language that we don't even realize.
Which is actually the perfect segue to my next question around harmony, because you explicitly stated that's what Holo's about. That's what is an extension of you. That's what you're about, the inner harmony, the outer harmony. And that's what I'm about as well. I don't know if you know that, because I'm very much trained in Taoist kind of way, right? So it's not to be so analytical that you're forgetting the magic and the miraculous nature of life, but then you're also not so very hippie-ish. So you forget the practicality of science and then action and all the things, right? So for me, all of this transformational work is about cultivating this inner harmony from within, as well as the harmony with other people, with the environment, etc. So I'm
Yeah.
curious to know, how did you come about this whole idea of harmony?
Yeah. So harmony, when I think of harmony, I think of music to an extent. And it's like we're all music makers of our own life. We have the instrument of this body, we have the instrument of the tools and resources that we have. And all we're trying to do with this instrument is make music. And we may have our own special instrument that we have to contribute to the tapestry of life. But harmony is the universal principle that is always unfolding. So I remember when we were originally talking about your podcast that there was this idea of moving from a finite game to an infinite game or moving from the finite to the infinite. And the difference between balance and harmony is balance is when you have something that's static that finds its balance point. Harmony is something that is actually very dynamic. It's always changing. And yeah, I think of harmony more as a journey than a destination. It's like something that we're always calibrating within ourselves and to our environment. And it's about vibration. And is this way that I'm showing up harmonious with the greater orchestra that's surrounding me? And that's where I find that it's like humans have really disconnected ourselves from nature to the extent that we don't know how to create that harmony. And I think that's one of the great lessons that we're going to learn as a species in the coming years, in the coming decades, millennia, is like, how do we return to not just balance, but harmony, because it's actually a relationship between the humans and the natural world, or the humans and each other. And that's what we're developing as a skill, is the capacity for harmony.
Okay. In terms of not only living your life with harmony yourself and with your kids, your family, and you have a retreat center, Holos, right, as a way to help others find harmony as well. Have you written down your own philosophical perspective that blends the indigenous traditions and Western psychology and all the different experiences you have had as a way to help transmit, this knowledge, this wisdom, so that others can be inspired by you and also have some tactical tools to help formulate their own way of finding harmony?
That's great homework for me. It's something that we're actively talking about, and how that's
Those who are aspiring to be more like Ian Michael, knowing what you know today, what would you say to them?
in the frame of going from a finite to an infinite existence, or exploring changing your perception. I would say the first step is trust. Just allowing yourself to die to what you know and to be reborn to what's possible. And then figuring out what is your North Star, or what is your compass. I think one of the contexts that we know each other through is Burning Man. And at Burning Man, I got to explore different ways of navigating the world. So it's a place that can be very chaotic. There's a lot going on. And what I would learn to do is use like the somatics of my body, fine tuning my awareness of what's happening in my body to guide me where I need to go. But everybody has their own way of interpreting the world and listening for whatever it is. You could call it signs, but like guideposts. And there's times on the journey when you're moving from a more structured, finite existence to a more infinite way of looking at life and what's possible. There's times where you may lose the track, you may lose the signposts. And there's a great book, A Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. And I used to spend time with the white lions in South Africa on this conservation project. So I really identify with lions. In this book, he says there's times where you lose the track, where it's like you're tracking a lion and suddenly the track is gone. But all you need to do is continue to move, and eventually you'll find the track again. So I think the important thing is just not to get too stagnant. You may want to pause, meditate, whatever it is, but allow the flow of life to keep moving through you and to become a vessel for something greater than one's own ideas. Yeah.
I love that. The image that comes to mind as we're speaking is using all of these type of practices, meditation, breath work, psychedelics, ayahuasca ceremonies, whatever the case may be, as a way to attune, to fine tune, to refine our antenna, our sensory perception, our perceptivity, and to trust the process, but continue to move and move towards whatever that esoteric North Star is. And if you don't know it yet, that's okay. Keep going until you refine and clarify what that is for you.
Yeah.
Cool, man. I know we cover a lot of ground. Are there questions that you think, man, CK should really ask me that question, but he didn't ask? Is there anything like that?
Maybe what is my North Star, or what's my underlying motivation for all of this? And I would say that my underlying motivation for everything I'm doing is that there's a really deep knowing that there's a better way for humans to be on Earth. Without moving way too far into the woo woo, I'm a fairly practical person. Like, I build things and I design things, and I really like physical structure. And at the same time, I've had in my journey access to states of consciousness, whether through psychedelics or otherwise, that have shown me what's possible in terms of what we talked about, and principles like harmony. I was in a workshop in the Netherlands, and I had this experience with another individual where we actually left the world and we were on another planet. And on that planet, there was such a higher gradient of consciousness. Consciousness was so much more pervasive. Like, you could see that every life form was very aware of the other life forms, and the processes of birth and death were much more fluid than they are on Earth. We have this idea of death being this thing where the form or the individual identity is done. But on these other spheres of consciousness that I've seen, things are much more fluid. There's a palpable sense of being loved by the universe and loving all form and loving all life. And so, if there's an underlying motivation or North Star for me, it's helping to infuse that level of consciousness and that level of connection into this planet.
With that, Ian, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge you. Thank you for sharing your story. It's super inspiring. And the level of thinking, your experience, how you threaded everything together that led you to where you are today, and how you're trusting the process and cultivating community and creating a container, effectively, a macro container, 200 acres. That's no small project, right? But in such a conscious way so that future generations can live in this world, this reality that came to you during ceremony. So thank you for continuing the work. And I wish you nothing but the best. I want to visit your land. So thank you so much for being here on Noble Warrior.
Yeah, very much look forward to welcoming you home to Holos. You're in the Diamante. But thank you.